The international arms trade could be shrinking. A study just released says this is because of austerity measures being taken internationally. And it reports arms manufacturers are now turning to cyber security sector to make up for the loss. But what about the unofficial arms market? And what would be the impact on the armed conflicts around the globe? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. The Middle East's biggest arms show has opened in Abu Dhabi. 80 companies from 15 nations are displaying their products at the International Defence Exhibition, or IDEX, which organisers say has doubled in size since it was last held 2 years ago. But it comes at a time of uncertainty for the global arms industry. Arms dealing has in the past been described as the most recession-proof industry in the world, but a Swedish research group reports that 2011 wasn't the best year for arms dealing. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute says sales among the world's top 100 weapons producers fell by 5% in 2011. This reversed a trend in which sales had risen by almost 25% in the previous four-year period. The major increase was in sales to developing rather than the highly industrialized nations. Well, some of the arms are purchased and stockpiled, but others are used in armed conflicts, two of which are underway. In Mali, the government has been fighting armed groups in the north of the country that are seeking autonomy from the central government. France recently deployed troops to help the government take back control from the rebels. In Syria, a bloody civil war between supporters and opponents of Bashar al-Assad continues unabated. And this has taken on a multi-regional dimension with foreign powers like Russia, Iran, Qatar and Turkey accused of interfering in or fueling the conflict. Well, joining us now are our guests. In London, Peter Felstead, editor of IHS Jane's Defence Weekly. Also in London, Kay Stearman, spokesperson for the Campaign Against Arms Trade. And in Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Kay Stearman in London. Do you believe there's really a slowdown, and why? It's certainly not because peace is breaking out everywhere.
No, it isn't. And I'd love to believe that this was the start of a global trend with the arms trade shrinking, but I suspect it might not be. It's just 1 year we're talking about, and there are reasons why it might look as though it's shrinking. I think Cypri has pointed out that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have wound down and equipment is coming home. But they've also pointed out that there are arms companies in China who probably should be in the top 100. We don't have the data on those. In other parts of the world, there are arms companies where we just don't have the data. And there's another factor as well, which is that military spending is often quite lumpy. If an arms company sells something like fighter jets or warships, these big platforms, then it's worth billions of dollars, and they tend to come sometimes 1 year rather than in another. So I think we have to wait a while to see if the arms trade really is shrinking.
Well, Richard Weitz in Washington, your view?
Well, yes, I think that the main reason were the slowdown in the economy in the most of the world, the fact that China is excluded from the figures, which is one of the largest emerging arms sellers, and the fact that there's been a sudden end of recent conflicts, drawing down of the Afghan war, end of the Iraq war, and some of these conflicts have seen a leakage of weapons out into the black market, so they're not going to be picked up in the figures that Cypri is recording of the formal state-to-state transfers.
Well, Peter Felstead, there does seem to be a huge amount of recycling of weaponry that goes on as well.
Yes, that's not really something new. I mean, the notion of cascading equipment down to allies has happened, for example, at the end of the Cold War. The United States cascaded a lot of equipment down to its NATO allies in Europe. So that does always happen. I think what we're seeing with these figures is that not even the defence industry is immune to the effects of the global financial crisis.
Yet we do see as well in these statistics that there was a growth of 1% only in 2010. This is after a growth of 8% in 2009. Now, the common factor there was the withdrawal of US forces from Iraq. So it would appear that the big armies do create a massive use and a flow in the arms market. Is it not, Kay Stearman?
Absolutely. The arms industry flourishes on war, and when war is actually happening, it ups its game and produces more. But it's still enormous even when wars aren't happening, because countries prepare for war. Arms industry is to some extent a national industry. It's promoted by national governments, and you see that countries do actually like to upgrade their weaponry. We see this in India now, which is one of the world's biggest arms buyers. It's trying to junk a lot of its Soviet-era weaponry and buy from Western countries instead.
Yes, Richard Weiss, this question of upgrading, of nations upgrading the quality of the military gear that they do have, is that an ongoing process?
Yes, and you could think of several reasons why. One, governments will spend some amount on military equipment, and naturally some of that percentage is going to go to upgrading. Defense establishments, the military want to have more advanced weapon systems as the threat, as they perceive it, increases. You sometimes have arms race dynamics. So, for example, if one country starts to upgrade, then the others will feel compelled to do so. Also, these systems wear out, and so you're going to have to buy a new one in any case. So for all those reasons, you're going to keep on seeing more advanced weapons appear in the inventories of most armies over time.
Well, at this particular point, Peter Felstead, it does seem as though it's a self-propagating industry in a way.
Well, I guess you can say that in some respects. When we talk about modern weapon systems, we're really talking about very sophisticated systems. So these days, it's not so much the platform itself, whether it's a tank, a ship or an aircraft, but the systems that actually go onto that. And those are forever being upgraded because it's a case of developing counter systems to the ones that are deployed. If you develop better armoured system, for example, then someone is going to need a better anti-tank system, anti-armour system to actually penetrate that. So in that sense, it is a continuous market.
Well, let's just take a look at the world's top arm makers and the huge sales that they generate. According to the latest figures, US arms giant Lockheed Martin tops the list. It sold $35.7 billion worth of arms in 2010. Second biggest is British company BAE Systems. It sold $32.9 billion of arms, around 95% of the company's total revenue that year. Boeing is third with $31.4 billion. That's around half of its total sales for the company most famous for its commercial airlines. Northrop Grumman, the world's largest builder of naval vessels, is fourth with $28.2 billion. And General Dynamics is fifth with $23.9 billion. Now, the bulk of arms companies are in the US or Western Europe, yet as the sales to industrialized nations have been dropping, those to developing countries are increasing. Why do you believe this is, Peter Felstead?
Well, developing countries they have an aim of becoming self-sufficient in arms. But in order to do that, they've first got to assimilate the technology. So what you find is they will start off by buying Western platforms from more sophisticated arms manufacturers, and then as part of that deal, they will demand technology transfer and the wherewithal to eventually build those systems in country. So at least initially, and we're seeing this with India, the first systems that are bought, Western systems, come straight in, but then the technology to actually produce those systems inside India is part of the deal. And this is how we can see the market progressing.
Well, Kay Stearman, is there an element of bait and a hook about this entire process, bringing customers in, ensuring that they remain customers?
Oh, absolutely, because as has been pointed out, in Western countries, there is a squeeze on military spending, although it's still a very, very large amount and a major part of most governments' budgets. But so arms companies do actually look outside. They try to give the best possible deals to countries, and that includes things like offset, training, local manufacturing, and so on. So there is that market out there, and they do actually go and try and get it. I think one thing which Peter pointed out earlier, he talked about upgrading of systems. Well, another part of an arms company business is obviously the servicing of the contracts, because you might sell the, let's say, fighter jets, but then you've got to maintain them, you've got to train the crews to fly them, and so on, and that can be an enormous business.
Well, you made mention earlier, Richard Weitz, of the connection between diplomacy and the arms trade itself. Now, how extensive is this? We do see nations that use weapons and arms as a form of foreign diplomacy, do we not?
Yes, there's a variety of ways in which you could use that. Let's take, for example, which many of your viewers are familiar with, the U.S. arms sales to the Persian Gulf. They serve several purposes. Economic, they help recycle petrodollars and so on, but the main function is diplomatic. Some of these countries are worried by Iran's conventional and possible nuclear buildup. The United States and other countries so far decided not to go to war with Iran over this issue, but they're trying to help reassure countries that are alarmed by strengthening their defenses, selling them weapons, helping them upgrade their own forces, and that in turn helps bind them closer to the U.S. foreign policy. But we have to be careful. Often this effect is exaggerated on both ends. People say, well, we should give arms to, for example, country X because then it'll be more beholden to us in its foreign policy. But that doesn't always happen. For example, Egypt turned on the Soviet Union after having received many arms, switched over to the United States, and vice versa. Countries sometimes think, well, let's buy American or Russian or European systems because then they'll come and defend us if we get into trouble. But that's not often happens because the sales are made independently one time, and you're going to have a lot of other factors that are influencing your diplomacy. So they are seen as a tool, and they have some effect, but they're not the dominant tool, and they don't have the dominant effect.
Well, we will continue this discussion in a moment, but let's just first take a look at some of the reactions on Facebook. Nishant Gupta says it also has a lot to do with higher indigenous production by countries like China and India, who are the largest users of imported arms. Janet Falloon says arms sales will fall, drones are the latest sales show. Rashid Khan says, it just irks me that all these weapons are used in offensive rather than defensive strikes, and the innocent are the casualties. Well, this brings us to the question, what steps are being taken to lower the risk of civilian casualties in the international arms trade, if any? Richard Weitz?
Well, the countries on their own, there are groups within those countries, such as either NGOs or within government. There are government groups that try and monitor arms sales, avoid them going to areas of conflict or where they could be provocative. There are international laws against transferring arms, some kinds of arms, or producing some kinds of arms. The UN and countries often impose sanctions on other countries that they don't think should receive weapons. We've seen this a lot with North Korea, for example, Syria recently. So there are all these sorts of plays. There's an effort to make more global arms control treaties. So, for example, the UN now has some monitoring capacity. Governments are supposed to report what major arms sales they make. And you have groups like CIPRI who help us keep track of that. But so far, there's not been a major effort to try and constrain arms sales. I mean, the fear is if you cut back on conventional arms sales, well, then countries that don't get conventional arms, perhaps they'll consider getting nuclear arms or something like that. They're very hard to monitor. There are many sources. There's a lot of sales going on beyond that do not come from government to government. So far, we haven't really done that. So we're basically getting to the point where we're trying to get more information on where the sales are and avoid selling to the most egregious regimes. But there's not a comprehensive effort to control the sale of conventional arms.
Kay Stearman, your view is enough being done to try and limit or control the dealing in arms?
Very little, really. Governments like the UK have rules and regulations that they're supposed to abide by. They have they have strategic export licensing system, which is not supposed to license weaponry to be sold to countries that abuse human rights or who are likely to use those arms against their own people, or who are aggressive against their neighbours, or who are in regions of conflict or tension, and several other provisos. But when you actually look at where we sell arms, where we license arms for sale, it absolutely defies any sort of common sense regulations. For example, Saudi Arabia, which has got a terribly poor human rights record, we've sold over £4 billion worth of arms since 2008. The fact is, once those arms have gone, you don't know how they're going to be used. You have no control over them whatsoever. So they can be used against civilians, they can be used to abuse human rights. They're often spent on areas where you would like to see funds spent on things like health, education, welfare. Money goes on arms. You have no control over those arms once they're gone.
Well, you have at the moment, for example, a controversy about the British sale of arms to Sri Lanka, a multi-million-pound shipment of small arms, it is described, which will be on its way to Sri Lanka, which has many accusations of human rights abuses even at present. Peter Felstead, is there any linkage whatsoever between ethics and the arms business as far as governments are concerned?
Well, I think increasingly the arms industry has realised that it needs to clean up its own act in terms of where it sells. It's unrealistic, I think, to think that the arms industry is going to go away. It's certainly not. And the sale of arms, let's face it, is a very political act. So I think the best that can be done really is to put pressure on one's government to actually make sure that those sales are ethical and are going to the right places for the right reasons.
Well, Kay
But
Stearman,
I don't think you're going to get rid of the arms trade.
Kay Stearman, good points being made there. The arms trade is not going to be got rid of. It is there to stay. We are talking about control, are we not? We are talking about policing it in some way. Would you agree with that?
Well, I don't think there's any such thing as an ethical arms trade. But we are realistic as well as being idealistic. We'd like to get rid of the arms trade altogether. But in the short term, what we would like to see is an end to arms sales to countries who are egregious human rights abusers, who are likely to use those arms against their own people. We've seen this happening in the Arab Spring, and who are countries that are either in conflict or in regions of tensions and conflict. That would be a good step. And it's not just idealistic organisations like Campaign Against Arms Trade saying this. For example, the parliamentary committees on arms export controls have been extremely critical of the way the government has handled arms sales and the way that arms have been sold to really very abusive dictatorial countries.
Well, we do seem to see a certain selectiveness in terms of who should be sanctioned for arms sales. You have international weight, particularly US-led, against any form of arms to Iran at the moment, to South Korea. There is still an ongoing arms embargo of Somalia, which the US is attempting to lead. But Richard Weitz in Washington, there is the sense of subjectivity in terms of arms embargoes, which would appear to undercut the integrity or the authenticity of the entire business, does it not?
Well, we don't have a comprehensive controls on arms sales, so it's been as much a concern as, for example, in the nuclear realm, where there are some countries that get to keep nuclear weapons and others that don't by law, and that's seen as discriminatory. In the conventional realm, what we're seeing is only these sanctions are either taken on a unilateral basis, and that makes a lot of sense. The EU and the United States can decide on their own values and political systems which countries should not receive their arms directly. The UN Security Council can, of course, impose mandatory arms embargoes, and that's where it becomes a bit of a problem. For example, the Russians say quite right they never sell arms to countries that are under UN sanctions that prohibit such sales. But Russia, like the United States, like several European countries, like China, can have the power to veto resolutions they oppose. So they can ensure that any country can get weapons they want just by vetoing those kinds of resolutions. So that's the case we're seeing now in Syria. Russia will prevent any resolution that would prohibit those sales. So it's a bit discriminatory, but it's not been so much an issue. And what I would like to add also, based on the good comments from your previous speakers, what we're seeing is more a focus on trying to not only prevent the most egregious regimes getting weapons, but also controlling the most egregious types of weapons. So no sale of material or that could lead to nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons. These controls are porous, but there's a strong effort to prevent that. There are some movements now to prohibit the sale of landmines, of light arms, and munitions that can be used against civilians and so on in an improper way. So we're seeing these two ends that will have some control, but there are always going to be problems of discrimination. There are always going to be problems of loopholes and leakages.
And also self-interest. You mentioned there the issue of landmines, the issue of cluster bombs, for example. The US will not sign any treaties forbidding the use of those weapons because it feels that its own interest would be threatened. Kay Stearman, we're looking at deep division in terms of trying to create some kind of standard policy in terms of dealing with the international arms trade and the weapons that are used.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the landmines issue is a very interesting one because Campaign Against Arms Trade was one of the original signatories and supporters of the movement to ban landmines internationally. And to a large extent that has been successful. But the point about landmines is that there were no major interests involved. No arms company made huge amounts of money out of manufacturing them. A lot of them were homemade, as it were. So there wasn't that much opposition. It's when you're actually talking about other sorts of weapons, you're going to get a lot more opposition because there's a lot more self-interest involved from both arms companies and governments.
Peter Felsted, your opinion on that self-interest from arms companies and governments?
Well, it's a very difficult question because certainly when we look at landmines and cluster munitions, I would say that there has been good progress made on countries signing up to those. What I would say is that the countries that do not abide by those rules, and I would say China would be quite a significant transgressor on the landmine side of things, well, that's going to mean that they're proliferated anyway, despite lots of countries signing up to them. I think ultimately the self-interest really does go to the highest strategic level because we are talking about geopolitical strategy here in arms sales and where they go to. So it really does come down to responsible legislation and as to how these are sold. Cluster munitions is a particular problem, and one of the reasons the Americans have not signed up to that is because they have certain triggering mechanisms in some of their weapon systems that they would say make them actually more accurate, but under legislation it might be discerned that they were actually cluster munitions.
Well, there
it's a very tricky subject.
It is indeed a very tricky subject, but the issue is as well that question of self-interest, and we do know the phrase mutually assured destruction. Will self-interest actually ensure that governments internationally will keep control of the arms trade? Do you think that self-interest is enough of a motive for them to do so, Kay Stearman?
No, I don't think self-interest is, unfortunately. We talk about self-interest. Last week, I think it was, Mr. Hollande was in India banging the drum for French arms sales, and this week Mr. Cameron is in there banging the drum for UK arms sales. So unfortunately, I think it's got to go well beyond self-interest. We do need international movement to stop the arms trade, I think, at least in its very worst forms.
Well, remembering as well that the United Nations will be debating the subject next month, attempting to create an arms trade treaty. But at that point, thanks to our guests, Peter Felsted, Kay Stearman and Richard Weitz. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want, send your feedback by email to the following address, insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.